All right, let's get started. Let's begin. So we might wait like 1 or 2 more minutes, just see if some more people trickle in. But yeah, we'll be analyzing some more Bobby Fischer today. So I am excited. Hopefully I won't knock over my mic too much today. We'll see how that goes. But we've already gotten through about 8 games in the Bobby Fischer 60 Most Memorable Games book. So this will be the start of game 9. Yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. This is Walter versus Fischer. Walter from Switzerland. And this is in Zurich 1959. So a lot of games from this tournament. Pawn to e4 by Walter, and Fischer plays his classic Sicilian. He's known for playing the Sicilian Najdorf. It was his favorite opening as black against 1 e4, knight f3, d6, and we're most likely going to see a Najdorf here. Takes, knight f6, knight c3, and of course a6. A6 signifies the Najdorf defense in the Sicilian. And the point of this move is you're stopping any bishop b5 or knight b5 move so that you can play e5 yourself. But a lot of great Sicilian players also just put the pawn on e6 and use the a pawn as leverage for a queenside attack. So not too it's not too rigid a setup. It's very flexible. Jack, I'm glad you like the layout. Yeah, I'm trying something very different, so I'm glad it's good. Glad it's good. Uh, so yeah, we have a6 here, bishop to g5, and now e6. This is the most common way to play against bishop g5. You don't really want to put your pawn on e5 because this bishop's already pinning you. So when you play e5, you're weakening the d5 square. You're just begging white to add more pressure to the pin, knight to d5, and your knight's going to be suffering. So that's why we play e6 here. And now f4, white continues with his plan. He wants to develop a kingside attack. Play pawn to f5, maybe g4, h4. This is all pretty standard stuff. There are even some lines where white goes g4, h4, allows the bishop to get trapped, and then just takes, and he's down a piece, but he has a crazy initiative. So that's something that happens in these variations sometimes. So f4, bishop to e7 is played, breaking this pin right here. Queen to f3, knight b to d7. This is all theory. We'll see if we get a brown system. A brown system is when black puts the queen here and goes for h6, g5, kingside expansion. So knight b d7 castles, queen side. Queen to c7 and bishop d3. Now I used to play h6 and g5 here, so this is definitely a way to go. Let's see what Fischer did. Fischer played b5. Okay, so he's going for stuff on the queen side. What I remember very clearly doing here, and I'm pretty sure that this is the position, I went h6, my opponent dropped back, and then g5. So it looks like you're giving up a pawn, but in reality you will get it back. Takes. And now the f4 pawn no longer controls the e5 square. So we've played g5 to distract the f4 pawn, and we go knight to e5 now. The queen goes back to e2, and now we take advantage of this pin right here. We go knight out to g4. And now we're creating this pin. Our knight defends this knight. We're getting ready to play h takes on g5, attacking the bishop. So for example, h3, h takes g5. And we are perfectly fine with this position right here. We're not even down any material, and we have the two bishops. Not to mention white has really weak dark squares. So this could be a very serious problem. Okay. Going back, Fischer didn't go for this. He went for b5, which at that time was probably the main line. Bishop takes f6. Okay, that's a little bit strange. Fischer gives this move as pointless. Yeah, it's not even being attacked. Black might at some point play pawn to h6. So I think with white, it's better to leave this bishop here. Fischer gives a3 as a better move. I think it's even reasonable for white to play for g4, but probably not taking this right away as he did. But he does, so takes, and Fischer takes back with the knight. Now, in my mind, this is a big decision point already. What do you want to take back with? You can take with the knight, you can take with the bishop, or you can take with the pawn. So Fischer takes back with the knight, probably because his knight on d7 was defending the knight on f6. They were superfluous knights, and now this knight finds a good home. He can just go bishop to b7, play like this. But I would strongly consider g takes on f6, just because I've seen it in positions like this where black takes with the g pawn, and this pawn structure is very solid and helps a lot in attacks. But here it might not be as good because white can put fast pressure on the setup, like maybe queen to h5, and white's already threatening knight takes on e6 because of this pin right here. Black can't move the f pawn. So this might not be an appropriate position to go for gf6. I think knight f6 is very reasonable. Now rook h to e1. These are pretty good squares for the rooks, d1 and e1, because these are the two files you're really going to play on, especially if black doesn't get castled in time. So Fischer now plays bishop b7, putting pressure on this pin. Now white can't move the e pawn at all, so that's a good thing for black. Bishop b7, now king to b1. If you're a Sicilian player or you play e4, so you face the Sicilian, then you know that king to b1 is a very common move in a lot of these variations because you're keeping the a2 pawn defended. You almost have this like castle kingside like setup with your king eyeing all three of these pawns. And on top of all of that, you now have a square for your rook if you need to come defend the c file. Your knight can come back. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility, this king to b1 move. Okay, so king b1 and now rook to c8. Just trying to put more pressure on the c file, maybe preparing for an eventual b4. Okay, so rook to c8. Now Walther played g4, just trying to get his attack going. That's probably why he played bishop takes f6 earlier, so that he could just go g4, g5 without his pesky bishop blocking the g5 square. Now he can get a pretty easy attack, but we'll see how good the attack is without his dark square bishop. Fischer goes knight to d7, g5, okay, he continues, and now knight to b6. So it's pretty clear that both sides are playing on their respective side of the board. Fischer has an advantage on the queen side, so he's playing here. Maybe b4, knight to c4 is an idea. Knight takes b2 with the queen eyeing the c3 knight. So there are a lot of ideas here for black, and white is, of course, playing for this huge, massive kingside initiative. So now Fischer's opponent plays f5, breaking through. Very strong move, because after e5, he goes f6. So he continues pushing, and it's becoming very clear that Fischer's opponent is making sure Fischer will not find a safe square for his king in this game. The king can't go queenside. The rook has already moved, and you better bet the king probably isn't going kingside safely, just because this pawn is going to have to take this one, and these files are going to be, especially this file is going to be very, very weak. So black can't risk anything like that. G takes f6, G takes f6, and bishop f8. And this looks like a really bad position. So I'm curious to see how Fischer gets out of this one. His opponent goes knight to d5, okay, with the idea that if you take and I take back, now my rook is on this file, open file. So after knight takes, e takes, we can't take this knight because the rook pins us to our king. So Fischer plays king to d8 here, getting out of this pin. And like I said, it's not like he was going to castle anyways. Neither side of the board is really safe for his king. So king to d8 makes a lot of sense, just accepting the fact that he's not going to get to castle. Knight to c6 check. Bishop takes c6, dc6, queen c6. And yeah, now we have opposite colored bishops. And the general wisdom on opposite colored bishops is if you get to an opposite colored bishop's position, and it's a middle game with queens on the board, then the side with better attacking chances has the advantage. So here, the advantage probably lies with white. It's opposite colored bishops, but white has good attacking chances, especially against this very weak black king on d8. But if it's an ending, then it's probably a draw. So keep that in mind, that opposite colored bishops is oftentimes decisive in middle games, but it's only drawn in endings. Shoe Factory, what's up? Glad you're here. Hope you like the new layout. But yeah, we're just talking about this Fischer game. He's playing a Swiss player. Yeah, he's playing a Swiss player as black here. Same tournament, Zurich 1959. And yeah, I was just talking about opposite colored bishops. So here white should have a slight advantage. Queen goes to b6 and queen h5. Okay. Clearly targeting the f7 pawn. And white can put a lot of pieces here. Bishop to d5 too. And it seems like black can be completely immobilized here. Like, let's say white goes rook g1 at the right moment. Now this rook can't move. This bishop can't move. So black is really, really struggling here. But let's see how Fischer untangles. I guess he's a very tricky player. That's what I'm learning from studying these games. So the king goes to c7. Wow. King goes to c7. Now he's just giving up this pawn, okay? Bishop to f5. Rook d8. And yeah, the queen takes on f7. Wow, how did he pull this one off? King b8. And now queen to e6, okay. Queen c7 with the idea of simply coming to the c file again. Protecting the d6 pawn, keeping an eye on any f7 advances. This move makes sense, trying to hold everything together. Rook to e3. This is a nice rook lift. White wants to rover the rook, move it up and over. Rook c3 is a really good landing square for this piece. But rook to a3, not bad at all either. So white has these two stellar options. This one attacking the queen and this one putting pressure on the already weak a pawn. So good move by white. Now black's bishop finally gets to escape a little bit. Bishop to h6. And white goes rook to c3 as we were mentioning. Queen b7. And now white finally takes the opportunity to go f7. And this has two purposes in my mind. One is you are getting closer to promotion. And the other one is now there's no rook to e8 to push your queen away, because we protect that square with our pawn. Yeah, Fischer calls this move very business-like. Not allowing rook takes d6. Takes, and then, oh wait, oops, not takes, rook takes d6, and queen to h1. So this would have been really bad. There's now a back rank mate. So instead he goes f7. Bishop comes back to g7, trying to open up a diagonal. No doubt Fischer wants to get in this e4 move, liberate his dark square bishop at last, try to create some threats. So this is the main idea here. He really wants to break open this diagonal. So bishop g7, rook c to d3, putting additional pressure on the d6 point. Bishop f8, and yeah, black is struggling. Queen takes e5 here. Wow, really nice tactic by white, with the idea that if you take back, he takes the rook, and he's winning his queen back. So d takes e5, rook takes d8, king to a7, and rook 1 to d7. So he wins the queen back no matter what. And though this is a bit of a simplification, white is going to be up one pawn in the resulting ending, and that one pawn is this one right here. So white doesn't have too much to complain about. Black goes h5. Just trying to push a pawn, saying, you can take my queen, but I'll just let you do that. I'll take back with my king. No point in taking and allowing you this check. So he goes h5. Rook takes b7, king takes b7. Pawn to c3, just trying to bring the king in. In an ending, they say the king is worth 3 points because it's a very useful piece, and you can use it to attack your opponent's weak points. So that's what white wants to do, try to use his king. King to c7. Yeah, Fischer wanted to see what his opponent would do next. He said ordinarily the curtains will be drawn here, so it would be a resignation, but he wanted to see what his opponent would do. He says rook e8 is better / winning, with the idea of targeting this. You can always come around for this, but his opponent goes rook to a8 instead. This is the choice of his opponent, rook to a8. And now king d6. Rook takes a6 check, and king e7. So Fischer said he was prepared to resign in just one move if his opponent had played rook e8 in either of those last two positions. And then white simply strolls the king to e4. But he goes for this, and now Fischer doesn't have a motivation to resign anymore. So rook to e6 check. King takes f7. So I guess the logic here is that you're not really going to be able to successfully defend this pawn. Bishop to e6 runs into rook h6. And if you go rook a7, the king comes to f6 and you're going to lose it anyways. Bishop e7, king takes f7. So I guess the logic here is I'm losing anyways, I'll just give it up. King takes on f7, rook e5, and now Fischer goes b4. And the game was adjourned after this move. So he's going to lose the pawn anyways, or he's going to lose the pawn anyways if he keeps it here. So might as well go b4, where the bishop is protecting it. Try to make some problems here on the queen side by ruining the white structure if he gets to take. So pawn to b4, cb4, bishop b4. And Fischer was sensing some swindling possibilities here. Pawn to h3. King f6, okay. Rook to b5, so attacking the bishop. And this is a very real threat because if black is able to, if white is able to trade this bishop for this bishop, then the ending is winning with these extra two pawns. So white really wants this bishop for bishop trade. But I imagine Fischer does not allow that. After rook b5, he goes bishop to d6, keeping his opposite colored bishops. Bishop to e4, and rook to e8. So now Fischer activates his rook. He's got some checks, so he's preparing to trick his opponent. Oops, not rook g5, rook f5. Let's promote that and delete this variation. Yeah, so rook to f5 is played, rook f5 check. King back to g7 and bishop to f3. Rook e1 check, the king comes to c2. Let's see where the pivotal moment in this game is. Rook to f1, pinning the bishop, making sure that if white tries to grab this pawn, he loses his bishop. Either way, he's losing something if he grabs the pawn. So he can't do that. Rook f1 is a good move in that regard. Rook d5, black's still completely okay with this. This transition is winning for white with the two outside passers. So he goes for rook d5. Rook f2 check. Now if you move up somewhere, the bishop gets taken with check. So rook f2 check is smart. Rook back to d2. Rook takes d2. King takes d2 and h4. So Fischer has now decided that this game is drawn. There's strong drawing chances. These pawns are immobile, so he can always plant his bishop here and run the king over. And one important thing is if this bishop can trade for these two pawns, and even if white somehow manages to win this pawn over here, the game will be drawn as long as this king gets back to this corner. So allow me to illustrate. Let me first put the actual move on the board. After h4, it was king to d3. But let's say black is able to sacrifice for these two pawns somehow. Just for the sake of example, let's just make sure this bishop is given up for these two pawns. Okay, like this. That was not the most logical way that could have gone, but the point I was trying to illustrate for those of you who are relative beginners is that even if white gets this pawn and is a bishop and pawn up, this pawn is not on the right, this bishop is not the right color for this pawn to promote, because the bishop can never give a check to check the king off of h8, so this will just simply be a draw. And I'll show the way that this game gets drawn. It's by stalemate. So you just go to the corner and finally there's a stalemate. But instead white goes king to d3. This is just Fischer's drawing idea I was trying to show. King to f6 and now king to c4. Alright. So now the king comes back to e7. Black's king also wants to make a journey over to the queen side. Okay, king to e7. King b5, king d7, and it does look like white has retained some fairly good winning chances. Fischer says that this next move, pawn to a4, throws away the win. I'm guessing that white wants to bring the king b6, just enter further into the position. But I'm actually really curious to see why this throws away the win, because it's such a natural move. You're just going a4, b4, and you're pushing your pawns. Zaraf, what's up? How are you doing today? We're just looking at some Bobby Fischer games. So a4, king c7. I'm very curious to see how this is a draw. b4, king b8, a5. Okay, so how is Fischer holding this? King a7, king c4. Okay. Bishop to g3. b5, bishop f2, bishop e2. Okay, this all seems fine. As Fischer notes, b6 check is met by bishop takes b6, and it's that same thing I was talking about earlier, where you run your king to this corner and you're totally fine. So instead, bishop back to e2. Okay. Bishop e3, so staying on this diagonal, making sure he can always sack the bishop. That's important. King to b3, bishop d2, and now he gives the check, b6. King b7, king a4, king c6, bishop b5 check, and king c5. And here they agreed to a draw. Because I guess after king c5, white is in a bit of a zugzwang, can't really advance these pawns anymore. Whenever you advance the a pawn, you're losing this pawn on b6, and whenever you advance the b pawn like so, the bishop comes back and holds the draw like this. So black did a great job of holding a draw here. I guess that's why this is one of Fischer's most memorable games, just coming back from a completely lost position. So far, we've seen two of those. Two games in which Fischer was pretty lost, but then came back. One was against Petrosian, if you guys were here for that. Okay, let's get into the next game. Game number 10. Starting position, orientation, white. Fischer was white in this game. XMGR saying, "Oh my, Dave's on fire." Yeah, I'm glad you liked the new setup. Really nice. Thanks, I appreciate that. Oh yeah, I'm not sure how I link my Discord with Twitch, but that'd be nice to show when I'm streaming on Discord. That'd be pretty cool. Not sure how to do that. I'll look into it. you could help me with that later, says Zaraf. That'd be awesome. Thank you. Much appreciated. Yeah, you guys seem to like these analysis videos, and it definitely helps me out too. I'm learning quite a bit, so uh, it goes both ways. But if you did see on the right-hand side, I did add a couple new things. So opening requests still the same. When I'm playing games, you can request an opening for $1 or 100 bits. A new thing that was actually added recently was the get your game analyzed. So for 300 bits or $3, we're doing that. Video request, that's the same. And personalized opening prep, that's still the same. And I actually changed the onesie thing from a sub goal to a donation goal, but I adjusted it for the people who had subbed recently. So I added 7.5 to the goal. But I did set up a thing through Streamlabs, so you can use the donation command or the donate command. XMGR saying Zaraf also was about to mention this right now. Discord server needs a bit organizing as well with the channels. Yeah, it's just one channel right now, right? Just like the general channel. Yeah, it'd probably be useful to organize it. You guys seem to know a lot about it, so I don't know if it's possible to give you guys authority on Discord to do things, but let me know if that is a possibility. Okay, but here Fischer is playing white, and we have another Rui Lopez. So far we've seen two Rui Lopez's, where Fischer's on the white side, and he titles this game Milking the Cow. So he gets some really nice positional victories here. That much is very clear, that he gets a lot of nice positional wins. So let's see what happens here. E4, E5, knight to F3, knight C6, bishop B5, A6. So we're going to zoom past the opening just as we've seen it all before. It's just a normal Rui Lopez, castles, bishop E7, rook to E1, B5. We have seen it all before. D6, C3, I'm guessing. Yep, castles. H3, knight goes to A5. Bishop C2, I'm guessing C5. Yep. Interesting. Actually, there's a note here that C6 is also an interesting try, not to weaken the D5 square. Okay, that's something that's interesting to keep in mind. So that's good. Jack saying that he's thinking about getting Fischer's 60 most memorable games from Amazon because of these streams. Do I have any options on Reassess Your Chess, or opinions on Reassess Your Chess by Jeremy Silman? Yeah, I'd recommend that book. I have it right here next to me. Growing up, I was never huge on chess books, but they're really helpful and they help a lot of people. So Jeremy Silman's a great author. XMGR, you'll bounce back. Don't worry about it. And Zaraf, in my Road to NM series, I say 3 games. If you lose 3 games in a row, stop playing. But let's get back into the Bobby Fischer chess. C5. And now white goes D4. So we've seen this 1,000 times. Not 1,000 times, but we've seen this particular variation twice before, and this with bishop D7 once before. So this is the second time we're seeing this bishop to D7 variation. And let's see how Fischer treats it this time. Knight to F1, rook F8. And he does the same thing, knight to E3. This is something he really likes doing, remaneuvering the knight to E3. He loves this square. And it makes sense. I mean, black has weakened the D5 square, so obviously you want your knight to control it. And you also want the knight looking out at F5. So this makes a lot of sense to me. Pawn to G6. Now D takes E5. D takes E5, knight to H2. So we've seen this maneuver before. Fischer just wants to bring his pieces to the king side. If you guys remember last time, we saw queen to F3, knight G4, something like this. So Fischer's doing the same thing again, knight to H2. Rook A D8. And queen to F3, yep, just as standard stuff. Bishop E6. Knight HG4 takes with the H-pawn, I'm guessing. Yep, he takes with the H-pawn. I remember asking you guys last time in this particular moment, what would you take back with? Would you take with the knight or would you take back with the pawn? And pawn takes is right. I remember someone was suggesting that after G3, you can go king G2, rook H1, which Fischer actually did at some point. But he also played G5. So let's see if he gets this again. Oh my god, so queen C6, G5. Have we looked at this game? I don't think we have, but this is the exact same position that Fischer reached last time. So this is the second game we're seeing in this G5 variation. I hope that we're not just looking at the same game. This is Fischer versus Unziker. Okay, maybe this is the same game. Maybe we're just repeating games. Knight C4. Okay, let's just check. Let's see if we're repeating games. Bishop takes, queen takes. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know. This might be the same game. Let's see. I'm going to skip forward a bit and check. Okay, no, it's actually not the same game. So everything has been the same up to this point, but it's not the same game. Saraf saying, with a semi-open file, would you not want to castle kingside to keep the rook on the H file? Well, I mean, the king wouldn't really be safe on E1. Like, we can see this rook menacingly staring down the D file. So white would have to deal with all of this stuff, the checkmate threats. So I think he just thinks it's more reasonable to get the king here and then eventually come up like this. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, so A4 gets played. Knight goes back to B6. Takes, and bishop to E3. Now, white's trying to take advantage of his two bishops. So if black pushes either of these pawns, then black's bishops can get activated pretty easily, which is what he's hoping for. Bishop E3 is just a developing try. Fischer says that his idea is to exploit loose pawns. And this pawn is definitely a bit loose, as is this one, just because they're not protected by each other necessarily, which is why he would call it that. Rook to A8 challenges the file, so it's a very reasonable move. Now, rook E to D1. And king to H8. Okay, getting out of any dodge on this G file right here, in case white ever plays for some sort of F4, E5, and just breaks open the position ruthlessly. King H8 is met with B3. Now white stops black from coming in like this. I'd imagine at some point white would be interested in fixing these queenside pawns somehow with an eventual B4, just to target the B5 pawn and open up this bishop's diagonal, but not in this position because B4 results in takes, and you're giving up some of your advantage here. That's not something white is interested in. So B3 is very solid. Bishop goes back to G7, okay. Not a very important move. Queen to H4. Bishop comes back to F6. And Fischer makes an interesting decision here. So he was a huge advocate of the two bishops, which is why you wouldn't really guess that he'd be willing to part with one of his bishops, especially his better one. This light square bishop is kind of staring at two walls, whereas this bishop is a great piece staring at two great diagonals. But Fischer goes bishop G5 here because he notices that although his bishop is super good, his bishop on E3 is super good, this F6 bishop is crucial to maintaining the black position. So it's really important that black holds on to this bishop because his king is going to be really unsafe without it. So after this trade, bishop g5 takes and takes. We see black's king is looking a little less safe. Takes, takes, and now knight to d7. So black decides that the a file isn't that important to him. It was more important to get white's rook off of this d file. So he trades the rooks and goes knight back to d7. And now Fischer plays bishop to d1. And he gives it an exclamation mark, but I also would. It is a very instructive move. So the point here is, I was mentioning before that white's bishop was hitting two walls here on these two squares. So he wants to do something to activate his pieces, and bishop to d1 is just that move. Now the one thing that we have to consider is what happens after queen takes e4. So the idea is good. The idea is you want to reroute your bishop to e2, put pressure on b5, but what about the most challenging try, queen takes e4? And there's a pretty cool line given here, bishop to f3, getting ready for bishop c6. Now queen to f4, white accepts the queen trade and goes bishop to c6. And basically the point here is that no matter where you go with black, you are losing a piece. If you go rook to d8, you're losing a piece to rook d1. If you go rook e7, you're losing a piece to check and rook a7. Either way, you're losing a piece. And throwing in the check is actually important, because if you go here right away, you actually allow your opponent to check and escape like this. So you have to throw in the check yourself so that when the king comes up, there's no check like this, and the knight doesn't escape because it's actually pinned to the king like this. Okay. But instead of all of this, queen takes e4 didn't actually happen. Instead, black went knight to f6, which we will promote. Knight to f6 was the variation in the game, and now rook to a7. So bringing the rook to the 7th rank is a great move. I talked about this concept of pigs on the 7th, that white really wants to eat everything up on the 7th rank. In this case, the 7th rank is already completely open, so queen h6, queen g7 is a mate threat. Black has to be pretty careful now. Queen to d6, holding everything together, solid move. And now bishop to e2. The bishop was attacked, now the bishop moves, but the bishop wants to be here anyways. E2 is a good square for it, so black essentially is forcing the bishop to a better square, which is why this move doesn't make complete sense. Rook to e7. Now rook takes, queen takes, and bishop takes b5. So Fischer decides to play this simply. Just take an extra pawn, be up a pawn, and try to convert this advantage somehow. So his bishop is also better than his opponent's knight, so he should be okay with the queen trade here. Now king to g7 is played. Now that the rooks are off the board, there's much less danger. Black can start bringing the king into the game. And typically, the queen and the knight are regarded as a better duo than the queen and the bishop, because the queen and the bishop kind of step on each other when it comes to squares that they control or attack, whereas the queen and the knight can attack very different squares effectively. But here, due to the pawn structure, this knight is quite limited in the squares that it can go to, so it's not necessarily as good of a piece. And we're going to see a really nice endgame grind here. That's the feeling I get. So king g7, bishop comes back to e2, queen c7, preparing to go knight takes e4, just grab his pawn back. So queen c7, now queen to e3, white drops back as well, protecting this pawn, Knight g4 or knight h5 aren't problems because we have our bishop protecting this diagonal. So white's pretty happy about the current position, I feel. Queen to e3, now queen a5, targeting this pawn. And just simply g3. Queen a3, and king to g2. So I guess white is claiming here that your threat doesn't actually matter, because if you take this pawn, I'm going to take your pawn on c5, and now my c pawn is a very clear passed pawn. Your c5 pawn is very important because it also allows me into these squares. So black doesn't really want this exchange of b pawn for c pawn. So king g2 is a very smart move in that regard. Queen to a5. So the queen just goes back. And now queen d3. Trying to come into d6. So the black queen stops the white queen from doing so by going queen b6. Queen c4, queen c6. So lots of weird queen moves here. A lot of queen maneuvering. But it all has a point, especially from Fischer's end. That is, queen on c4 is better than the queen on e3. Because you're making the same threat, but you're also making additional threats of b4. So queen c6, now bishop comes to d3. Queen goes back, and finally white starts pushing on the queen side with b4. You really want to try and take advantage of your queen side advantage. This is the side of the board on which you've got to play. Try to get in queen c5 and push your passer. White is up a pawn here, so you should try to take advantage of that. cb4, cb4, and knight to g4, okay? Queen c5, bc5. So black has evaluated this ending as a draw. But we'll see how it ends up turning out. This pass pawn is incredibly dangerous, and in my mind, worst case scenario, white utilizes this pass pawn to create sufficient threats, and while the black king and knight are distracted, white comes up the board and tries to win over here. So b takes c5. Now the king comes to f7, trying to snake around and win this pawn before white can do anything serious. And now white goes f4. The idea is to create another passed pawn in the center. That's Fischer's annotation. He really wants to create this passed e-pawn, and he doesn't mind if black gets a passed h-pawn in the process, because the king's already here. Like, what's your passed h-pawn going to do if my king is already protecting all these squares? So f4 has that idea. Also, possibly f5. So I wouldn't be surprised to see king e7 f5. Just trying to create a pass pawn by whatever means possible. Okay. So the king goes to e7, and we see king f3 attacking this knight, okay? Knight goes back to f6, and now bishop b5. And the idea is to dominate this knight, not allowing it to come back to either of these squares, because the bishop will simply chop it off the board and get an easy win. So cutting off all these knight squares, the king goes to e6, now bishop c4 check, king e7, and c6, which Fischer gives an exclamation mark. Very powerful move. What happens on king d6? I'll let you guys tell me. What happens on king d6? The actual move played in the game was knight to e8, so let me promote that real quick. But what do we do if our opponent goes king d6? Give me a variation. Take some time to think about it too. Just make sure it works. Yeah, as Raf says, f takes e5, king takes e5, and c7. Yeah, f takes e5 is a very powerful move. That is correct. What Zaraf said, you guys are all getting it. That's great. So yeah, f takes e5, king takes e5, c7. There's no way to stop this promotion, no matter how hard black tries. And in addition to this, f takes e5 is kind of a weird fork, because you are forking these two pieces. Black can't take this pawn because you just take his knight. So nice variation there. Knight to e8 is played instead. And now f takes e5, just grabbing a pawn, also taking squares away from this knight and the king. So now black actually can't go to any of these 3 squares because the pawn and the bishop block them all off. So f takes e5 is a good move in that respect. h6, and now we see king e3, knight c7, king d4, and here, okay, so here Fischer has two plans. He could do 2 different things. He could either continue by going king to c5, king to b6, continue this way and try to promote, or he can go back this way. And the first thing you have to calculate is king c5, obviously. You've already gone king to d4, so the first thing that you have to calculate is king c5. So let's take a look at that. King c5, g5, king to b6, h4 takes here, bishop back, h2, bishop here. So this does work. We're in time, but okay, let's try another variation. King c5, g5, king b6, knight goes back to e8. Maybe this does work out for white. King c5, unless you guys see anything. All right, Zaraf, you're going to have lunch. See you in a bit. King c5, g5 here. Why doesn't this work? h4. Oh, wait, no, just king d8. Protect the knight. And, yeah, e6. h4. e7. Takes. And then you start pushing this. I think this variation works out for white, king c5, but Fischer just goes king to e3, simple enough. He's trying to bring his king back here and win these pawns. g5, bishop to e2. And now Fischer's really trying to force the win of one of these pawns. h4, g takes h4, g takes h4, and bishop to c4. Now this is an idea that you guys should remember. Dominating the knight with the bishop. Whenever there are 2 squares between the bishop and the knight, that means that the bishop is dominating the knight because it takes away all of these squares that the knight controls. So very important idea to understand. Bishops dominating knights. 2 squares apart means that the bishop is dominating the knight. So bishop to c4, very strong move. The knight goes back to e8. It can only go backwards now. King to f4, king d8. King to g4. White's idea is simple enough. He just wants to pick up this pawn. King f4, king d8, king g4, king c7. And now, wow, this bishop f7 move is very timely. Now that the c7 square has been taken away by black's own king, white brings the bishop into f7, knight to g7, king takes h4, king takes c6, and king g5, after which black resigns. And the reason that black resigns is pretty clear. The king can't come back this way, and this knight is going to get trapped on the next move. Just king g6 traps the knight. So if you're not in time to win the pawns, for example, king c5 here, king here takes. No matter which pawn you take, you're going to lose. If you take this one, this pawn promotes. And if you take this one, I just defend my pawn and I will end up promoting it. It'll just run all the way home. So that's the reason that white gets the win there. Okay, 2 games down, 2 to go. I'm committed to analyzing 4 Bobby Fischer games on each of these streams, and then we can do whatever you guys want. I am planning to play some sub games, hopefully in an attempt to reach that donation goal, which we're 30% of the way to. And yeah, then we can see if you guys want to do game analysis, we can redeem that second thing on the donation menu. We'll see. Okay. Let me take a quick water break before this next one. Fischer versus Benko. This should be a good one. Paul Benko. And this is actually in the Candidates Tournament 1959. So it looks like Fischer was going on quite a tear in 1959. Just tearing everyone up in that year. All of these games have been from 59, I'm pretty sure, 1959. So, yeah, I mean, he must have been playing really awesome chess in that year. But Benko is a very strong player. I wonder if we're going to see a Benko gambit. Although Fischer wasn't huge on d4, mostly just played e4, so probably not. But for those of you who don't know what the Benko gambit is, it's Paul Benko's gambit against d4. Okay, let's, so Fischer's white here. Daniel Siegel says, nice new layout. What does personalized opening prep entail? So let me answer that question. First of all, what's up, Tango Bob? But yeah, Daniel, so personalized opening prep entails you just tell me what variation you want me to look at, and I will prepare a PGN file that you can open through whatever chess file reader, PGN file reader you have. There are multiple free ones as well as just ChessBase if you have it. But yeah, I create an in-depth opening analysis on the particular variation that you want. So let's say you're interested in learning the Sicilian Con. I will prepare an in-depth PGN file on the Sicilian Con and send it to you by email. That's basically what it entails. Let me know if you have any questions on any of the other ones. The Get Your Game Analyzed is a new one. So let me know if anybody's interested in that. You can use this command right here if you want to do any of them. This one right here. I just dropped it there. But okay, let's jump into this next game here. We have Fischer versus Benko from the Candidates Tournament in 1959. And this is a Sicilian defense called Unheard Melodies. That's the name of the game. So e4, c5, knight to f3, knight c6. We're going to see another open Sicilian here with pawn to d4. Takes. And now knight f6, knight c3, and d6. So here black is going for the classical variation in the Sicilian. And this is something I actually have a good deal of experience with from the black side. So I used to play this opening. And it's a very solid weapon for black, for sure. And here Fischer plays bishop c4, which is undoubtedly one of the most sharp variations against the classical. There are two main lines that are very sharp here. Bishop c4 is one, and Fischer was great at these positions. And bishop g5 is the Richter rouser. Daniel asking, is the game analysis on stream? It is on stream. The game analysis is on stream. Yeah, and the games in which you're outplayed are the best games to look at. Absolutely. Thanks for clarifying all those. Thanks for asking all those clarifying questions. That's very helpful. So yeah, this bishop g5 is the Richter rouser, and bishop c4 is another extremely sharp variation. So a lot of bishop c4 lines are actually named after Fischer. Fischer-Sozin in some cases. Now here I used to play for this e5 move, and this is a very sharp variation, but Paul Benko goes for queen b6 here, just directly attacking the knight, hoping to clarify some things in the center of the board. So yeah, queen to b6. Now knight d to e2, just swinging the knight back. Doesn't want it to be taken for free. And also, he can't go bishop to e3 here because the b pawn hangs. So knight d to e2 makes a lot of sense. He also doesn't want to go back to b3 because he wants to keep that square for his bishop. That's one more thing in this position. Keep this square for your bishop. Now black goes pawn to e6. Fischer just castles. Bishop to e7, and now bishop to b3. So this square is useful for the bishop, as I pointed out. And now the b2 pawn is no longer hanging. So white can go bishop to e3, hitting the queen, as this bishop is no longer hanging. So okay, bishop to b3, now black castles. King to h1. And you guys tell me, what's the idea behind king to h1? What's the reason White's playing king h1? Is it just because he likes the side of the board, he likes to be in the corner? Or what's the reason? What's going to happen now? And you don't have to really give me a variation here, just like White's moves. Just give White's moves. Daniel Siegel just donated $3. Thanks to Daniel. Can you send me the game on Lichess? Just in a message. That'd be great. And it's actually my first donation, and we can see that donation bar going up. Now it's at 1050. Awesome. So right after we're done with the Bobby Fischer games, we are going to look at Daniel's game. Yeah, send it to me as a message on Lichess. My username's giraffe_chess. Thank you to Daniel. We will be looking at Daniel's game. So king to h1, with the idea, like Daniel said, of pushing the f-pawn. We want to go f4. That's one plan. And then we can even swing our queen around like this, with the bishop coming to g5 as well. But yeah, the main idea is f4. Main idea is f4. So king to h1, sharp move. Now knight to a5, trying to trade off this really good bishop. Black ideally wants to get this bishop off the board, because if White gets in f4, f5, and Black has to commit with this e-pawn, then all of a sudden this bishop can become an absolute monster right here. And that is not what Black wants in the slightest. So knight to a5 is a good move in my opinion. Bishop to g5, creating this pin, getting ready to play for f4, f5. And now Black plays queen to c5. So yeah, Fischer writes here that Benko was trying to provoke bishop e3, queen back to c7, and White's initiative is kind of dying here, even though he does still have plans of f4, so maybe he's being too harsh on himself. But f4, now b5. So Benko is waiting a little bit. He realizes that this bishop on b3 can be taken at any time. By the way, yeah, Daniel, I just got your message. So we'll check that out right after these two games. Pawn to b5 played. Now knight to g3. Okay, the knight on g3 is very effective in that it's supporting the f5 break. The knight can even come to h5 in certain situations if you want to trade off some of Black's key defensive pieces. And you're also preparing to bring the queen into the game. So knight h5, queen takes h5, or even rook to f3. So this is a good move. You're also preparing to bring your other knight back to e2. Safe square for it, reroute. So very multi-purpose move, my favorite type of move. Black goes b4, and now let's try to think of a plan for White here. I have the moves in front of me, so it's kind of cheating that I that I know what's going to happen already. But let's just try to think, what's the best way to respond to this? Do we just move our knight out of the way? Or is moving the knight back too much of a beta move, and we want to play like an alpha, so we want to do something else? What's the most dynamic way to play in this position? Let's try to brainstorm some ideas here. So my first instinct is think about moving the knight, and that's why I'm also learning something from this game, that you don't have to react to all your opponent's threats. To be fair, that's something I knew, but Tango Bob says 92 looks natural, not alpha. Yeah, Tango Bob, you can't play like a beta. You can't play 92. Even though that is probably my first instinct here. Knight to e2. Race to GM suggesting bishop takes f6. And then after bishop takes, what do you want? What do you want to do? Okay, so Jack saying, couldn't you do knight a4 to threaten the queen? You could do knight to a4. It does threaten the queen. Race to GM also interested in knight to a4. I think the problem here is knight a4 does threaten the queen, but then our knight feels kind of stranded here, right? Like it doesn't have any squares left. So the queen goes back, and now black might try to hit our knight, bishop d7, and try to make some threats on it. But more importantly, our knight isn't making threats on a4 after the queen moves. So this idea is very interesting. He wants to bring the knight to e4. That's like the ideal square for the knight to go to. But right now it's not possible because your pawn is there. So do we have any ideas on precise continuations here to take advantage of the position? And this move is pure genius. Race to GM says maybe there's some e5 pawn sack. Yeah, that's absolutely right. e5 is the correct move here. And the idea behind it is genius. So d takes e5, and now Fischer wants to go knight e4, but he inserts an intermezzo, and this is something that we've seen in previous games. Bishop takes f6, intermediate move. Now after bishop takes f6, so black plays g takes f6 here, but what happens on bishop takes f6? Knight comes to e4, the queen comes back here, and now what? Knight to h5 is Fischer's idea. This is beautiful. Yeah, knight to h5. Now you're attacking it twice. If the bishop moves here, you can simply push it away. And if he allows you to take, now you have really good pieces. So let's say here, you take with this knight, and then you deliver mate. So yeah, and queen g4, yep. So this is absolutely beautiful. Very nice by Fischer. So his opponent takes with the g pawn, and now you can really feel how exposed the king side is. You feel your opponent's pain. Tango Bob says cool. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. So yeah, he takes this. Now knight comes to e4 with tempo. The queen goes here. And do you guys want to trade queens? You guys wanna trade queens here? Yeah, still knight e4. Yep, the knight comes to a really good square. That's the point of our e5 sacrifice. We want this e4 square for our knight. Race to GM says no, we don't want to trade the queens. Queen h5. Yep, I like that. Tango Bob also agrees no, just go queen h5. And Fischer also agrees with you guys. So he goes queen h5. He heard the cries of Tango Bob and Race to GM, and he doesn't go for the queen trade. He goes queen h5. Yep. And Fischer says already black is without a satisfactory defense. A biting critique here. Already without a defense. Now knight takes b3, and this is why Fischer is such a genius. I would instantly recapture a takes b3, no question. It opens up my rook's file. I'm taking back a piece, but this guy plays queen h6, and in a classical game, I'd probably play this move, but in blitz or in rapid, oh, definitely just take the knight back right away. That's instinct. Yeah, rook d1 is an interesting intermediate move, but this just threatens mate. The idea is you want to go knight h5 and queen g7, and this mate is very, very difficult to stop. So queen h6, now e takes f4, with the idea of playing f5 and having your queen defend the mating square here. So this is black's idea. He wants to go f5. He wants the queen to defend the mate. So after e takes f4, knight h5 anyways, f5 like we were saying. And, okay. Now this beautiful move, rook a to d1. So you want to go queen g7 checkmate. You also want to go knight into f6. So you're forcing your opponent to make a move that he does not want to make. Just to quickly explain something, if you go knight f6 right here, takes, it looks like you're forcing mate, but your opponent can sack the queen, take this rook, And you are completely winning here, no question. But it is going to be a queen for a rook, bishop, and a couple pawns. So, yeah, queen h6 is genius. It is genius. So that's why Fischer doesn't go knight f6 right away. He goes rook to d1. Now if you take the rook, I'm mating you a couple different ways. So you got to do something else with the queen. The queen goes to e5. That's a good square for it. Now knight e to f6 check. Takes. Everything gets taken. Black can't do anything except this, because if he goes king h8, there are two different mates here. Queen takes f8 and queen takes h7. So he's left with no options here. Yep, race to GM, that's right. If queen h8, then knight to f6. Absolutely correct. So, okay, after this, everything gets exchanged off, and there's no hope left for black. Let's see how Fischer finished this game off. Knight to c5, queen g5 check, king comes to h8, the only square it can go to. Queen e7, nice fork between the knight and the rook. Bishop to a6, attacking this rook. Queen takes d5, bishop takes f1. And after rook takes f1, black just resigned, because it is just a queen for a rook. So it's pretty hopeless here. Pretty hopeless. What's up, Kirkanos? And Zaraf is back. Awesome. So we just finished game 3. Beautiful game by Fischer here against Benko. Now we have the final Fischer game for today, Gligorich versus Fischer. And then we're going to move on to some other fun stuff after we finish this Fischer game. So Gligorich is white from Yugoslavia and Fischer is black. And we have another Sicilian defense. This one is titled Castling into it. So it should be a pretty fun one. This should be pretty fun. Okay, let me just set this up real quick. Orientation black. Okay, so we're probably going to see another Najdorf, and these Najdorf games are pretty inspiring. Fischer played the Najdorf in an interesting way, but I don't feel the same way about these Najdorf games that I do about his like e4 games, like with the Sozin variation against the Sicilian, because those seem so sharp and straightforward, and you understand his ideas clearly. But yeah, like these Najdorf games seem like Fischer's getting lucky some of the time. He's like barely escaping some of these attacks. So it is definitely a much different dynamic when you're seeing Fischer from the black side, just because you are on the back foot when you play with the black pieces. So let's go ahead and jump into this. Gligorich plays e4. Now we see c5. Knight to f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4. And we're just going to zoom past these opening moves because we've seen it before. a6, bishop to g5. We've seen this exact variation with e6. f4, bishop e7. Yep, this is all very standard. Queen f3, queen c7. Castle is queenside, knight bd7, g4, and b5. So this is where the game slightly differed from last time. Fischer's opponent in the last game that we saw played bishop to d3. Fischer still played b5. One thing I'll note is that in these positions, if white ever goes pawn to e5, attacking the knight and attacking the rook simultaneously, we have this nice bishop to b7 move that comes to our defense. And the idea behind this is we're attacking the queen, so the queen no longer has threats on our rook. And once the queen moves, we have a lot of options. First of all, we can just grab a rook. That's an option. We can straight up grab a rook. And the other thing is we can take this pawn, d takes e5. Daniel asking, am I getting these games from Fischer's 60 memorable games? I am. So this is Fischer's 60 most memorable games. We are working our way through this book. Great book. And we're trying to provide some accessible analysis. So, okay. After b5, instead of e5, Fischer's opponent goes bishop takes f6. And this is a pretty common idea. We saw in the last game too, right? And the idea is that we want to, or with white, we want to play g5, but our bishop's in the way. So what better way to deal with it than just take a knight? So bishop takes f6 played. And now Fischer plays this idea that I was talking about, g takes f6. If you guys were here earlier in the stream, you heard me mention that in this other position, I was considering, this was the position right here, bishop d3, b5, takes. I was talking about how I would consider taking with the g pawn because it's solid. But the reason that I wouldn't is because of this queen h5. And now there's knight takes e6 threatened. There might be knight to d5, a ridiculous sacrifice like this. So that's why I wouldn't do it. But in the actual game position, notice that the pawn's on g4 already. So there's no queen to h5. And that's why Fischer takes back with the g pawn. Because this threat is not there anymore. So gf6 and pawn to f5. Now knight to e5, okay? Bringing the knight into this e5 square. So white does a little give and take here. He gives up the e5 square, but he gets a bit of an attack. Zaraf asking, what happens on 12 g5 instead of f5? Great question. And keep these questions coming, please. I love them. So g5, great question, Zaraf. I would imagine there's f takes g. And after fg, did you want to go queen to h5? So if fg and you go queen h5, now the idea is pretty clear, and it's a good one, that if you take now, Zaraf wants to take on e6, and there's a pin, you're attacking the queen, and this is monstrous. But I think after queen h5, black has knight to f6. And now the bishop defends e6. We're attacking the queen. And as black, we have some nice discoveries here. Knight takes e4. Discovered attack against the queen. Queen g7, bishop f6. So we're holding everything together if we're the black player. But very good try. I hope that answers that question. f5, we could still play g5 in the future, just a pawn sacrifice. So it's not a bad idea by any means. Okay. So f5, now we see knight to e5, and queen to h3. And now what would you do here with black? I don't think I would play the move that Fischer played here, or I know I wouldn't play the move that Fischer played here. But let me know. Just think about the position. Let me know what's your idea with black. How do you want to play? Where do you want to play? Just what's the next move? No need to give a full line. No need for a full variation, just a move. Feel free to think about it for a bit longer before I spoil it for you guys. But basically, his opponent... So, yeah, Zaraf suggesting rook to g8. That's interesting. Rook g8. If I can draw my arrows. Rook g8. I think that the idea is white wants to bring this queen into h5, right? So, if rook g8, I think there might be queen takes here. And if you take this, well, white has a lot of options, but amongst them, queen h5 looks pretty tempting. Maybe go here first, then drop in queen h5. I'm not sure, but this does look very risky for black, this rook g8 idea. I do like it, though. Keep the suggestions coming. So you want rook g8, queen h7. And rook takes g4, queen h8, king d7. Okay. You want to go here. Okay, now I can probably take, and go bishop h3, right? And try to take your pawn on e6. Yep, preventing any b5 sack. Yeah, so this position is very risky, especially because of the weakness of the e-pawn right here. But good ideas, good ideas. Rook g8 makes sense. Race to GM wanted h5. This is a move I would definitely consider, h5. You want to break up this initiative just because now there's no queen h5. So maybe after g takes h, you're thinking about maneuvering your bishop. But a problem with this position is that your e6 pawn is still so weak. Like, this is a problem that you really still have to deal with. Yeah, no, sorry, Zaraf. I'll stop giving stuff away like that. But here Fischer played a really cool move. It was O-O. He just castled. And this move is kind of mind-blowing because he's castling into it. That's the name of the game, castling into it. And it's a pretty cool move because he noticed that his opponent doesn't have any concrete threats. I'd be afraid of queen h6 by white. But Fischer says that this defense is sound. Queen h6 seems reasonable to me, just trying to bring the queen in, try to play h4, g5. So in the game, Gligorich played knight c to e2, intending knight to f4, so just targeting this weak e6 pawn. But yeah, I totally agree that queen h6 and then g5 looks super scary. So yeah, Zaraf pointing this out as well, that this looks scary. So what does black do? Originally, I was thinking maybe you go rook e8, bishop to f8, drop back. And that might be Fischer's plan, just give up a pawn, huh? So let's say we go rook e8, h4, bishop f8. And now we just give up a pawn like this. This could be the idea. It's not completely unreasonable. So I could see black wanting to go for something like this, just a pawn sack. In the game, though, Gligorich played this move, which is equally good, because he could be bringing his knight into h5. That's one thing. And the other thing is the knight on f4 also attacks this pawn. So black is in some serious trouble, in my opinion. But king h8. Now knight to f4 following through. Rook g8. And rook to g1. So he doesn't want to give up the g4 pawn. It's very important to the position. So rook to g1 makes sense. And now d5. Wow. Suddenly the game opens up. Interesting. So Fischer has the bishop pair. That's one thing about these positions that's consistent. And we see it a lot in the Ruy Lopez too, in his Ruy Lopez games, right? That he has the bishop pair. And he always finds some way to make use of it. So this is a very instructive moment, I think, because Fischer realizes that he has this advantage of the bishop pair, and he wants to do everything he can to take advantage of it. For example, after d5, things open up such that you can play bishop c5, something like this. So he also does say that black's game hangs by a hair. And that makes sense, that these pawns are all hanging. So Gligorich plays f takes e6. And now Fischer takes the pawn on e4. So very enterprising play. He wins this e-pawn, central e-pawn. And this f-pawn is defended by his knight. So he's not risking too much, which is important. So yeah, d takes e4. And now knight to d5 comes. Okay, and this position looks super messy. Fischer makes a move that defends the queen and defends the bishop. Queen to c5. Now knight takes e7. Queen takes e7. And knight f5. So Gligorich's attack just does not stop. He's relentless. Now Fischer goes queen takes e6, just taking a pawn while he can. And the queen comes into h6. So now the idea appears to be rook g3, rook h3. Just a rook lift to threaten mate. So let's see what ends up happening. After queen to h6, Fischer goes bishop to d7. Okay, connecting the rooks possibly with the idea of rook coming up to g6. if he goes rook g6 in this position, there's always rook to d8 with mate. So actually rook to d8 is a threat anyways, because if you go rook d8 and black takes, you have mate on g7. So let me just show a pretty cute line here. So let's say black goes, what, knight c4 or something like this, rook d8. Now let's say bishop d7. We go queen g7 with mate because the rook pins. So this is what black had to be very wary of, which is why bishop d7 right away is so crucial, because now there is no rook to d8 with mating threats. If I'm going too fast at any point, feel free to slow me down. Just say I'm going too fast. But yeah, I get excited by checkmates like that. Bishop d7, now rook to d6. Attacking the queen, threatening the f6 pawn, very strong move. And now Fischer plays another intermediate move. This guy is all about intermediate moves. Oh my god, every single game he's playing some sort of intermediate move. Before defending the queen, he goes knight takes on g4, with the idea that everything seems to work out tactically. We can look at all these variations, but let's start with this one. If rook takes on g4, Fischer can take this knight. So this is fine for him. He's not getting mated. For example, rook h4, we can take this bishop, or even like queen g5 trading queens if we're super scared. If let's look at the next variation, rook takes queen. There's knight takes queen, rook takes, and I'm guessing knight takes. Probably just knight takes. Yeah, probably just knight takes, although rook takes seems to work as well. Takes, 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 everything gets taken, and black is just up a few pawns in this ending. So that also looks pretty good. So knight takes g4 really does seem to be working here. Rook takes g4 is played. And queen takes f5, yep, this is the line that we were talking about. And now rook takes on g8 with check. So this is what Gligorich goes for, rook g8. And it really does feel like his advantage has dissipated almost entirely. He did have a pretty good attack, but now it seems that black is defending. Black threatens a queen trade as well, which would be good for him. So yeah, this attack has not gone anywhere. Fischer successfully fended it off. After this, rook takes g8, rook takes g8. Now, actually, Fischer says that the winning line is king takes g8. This is a better move. Because rook takes f6, queen e5. Okay. With an extra pawn in a dominating position. So I guess the point is that the king defends on f7, which is important. So that's pretty cool. But, okay, rook takes g8 is just a very natural defense. Rook takes on f6 and queen to d5. So despite the very scary attack that used to be, now Fischer is the one who refuses the queen trade. He doesn't want queen g5. He says, I'm fine with keeping the queens. You're not going to mate me. So queen d5. Rook goes to d6, and then queen goes back to f5. Rook f6, and now Fischer says, okay, if you're going to repeat, then I'll trade. If you're going to go for a draw, I don't want to draw. So I'm going to trade the queens, takes, takes. And now rook takes f7. The bishop comes to g4. And it makes sense that Fischer doesn't play for a draw here because he has this pass pawn. So it's equal pawns, but black has this passer. And although it is isolated, it could potentially be weak. Here, it does definitely seem to be more of an asset than a liability. Just because we do have e3, e2 threats. Bishop f3 is also a threat. Rook coming down to g1. So black's doing well. And we see just that. King d2, the bishop comes to f3, firmly planting itself on this square. King to e3, and now rook g1. So all the moves we were just talking about happen. Bishop to h3. And now rook e1 check. King f4, and very cool move here. Bishop to d1. Shoe Factory, welcome back. Welcome back. So, yeah, last I saw, Magnus was leading Anish by 1 point. Not sure what it is now. Good moves. Welcome to the channel. Just followed. I added that little thing too to the stream. So it shows when people follow or donate or stuff. So hopefully that's a nice little addition. But yeah, Bishop D1, and Fischer says, playing as Dr. Tarash Riley put it, for the loss. He says, nowadays I would know better than to try to squeeze out a win of such a simplified ending. But I think this is actually kind of cool. Oh, you guys can't see that? Oh. I didn't realize. So you guys can't see when people like donate or follow. Like you can't see it on the... It should be where the moves are. I think it is supposed to be visible because I see it on the stream preview. Next time someone follows, just look right around this area right here. And you should be... Oh, yeah, you saw it? Okay. That's good. So I think Bishop D1 is kind of clever, but Fischer says it's playing for the loss. King E5 makes sense. Gligorich also playing for a win. This king looks very mateable. King F6, Rook F8. So both sides playing for a win. Now E3, trying to promote his pawn. Bishop to F5. And Rook to G1. So there's no way to defend this. Fischer just has to give it up. Takes. King to G8. Rook comes to C7. Okay, so he's still trying to get some sort of mating attack in. King F6, Rook C8. And that makes sense. So Bishop G4. Now Bishop takes, Rook takes. Yeah, Bishop takes, Rook comes to C3. So now he's going to come back and defend like this, which makes sense. Okay, yeah, no worries, Seraph. I'm glad it's working. So, okay, Rook C3, now E2, Rook to E3, and Rook G2. So Fischer's defending this pawn, but it's clear that he's no longer going to be promoting this. Now he really is fighting for a draw. He's down a pawn, so he's probably going to try to promote this and then try to take these pawns and try to make a draw like this. So rook to G2. Now King D4. And yeah, like I was saying, E1 equals queen. Before the king gets back to C3 to defend this pawn, Fischer has to just go for this. So takes. And now he takes on C2. And Rook B1 is a smart move. This is a really smart move. He knows that he's fine with giving up the H-pawn because he has the best chances in Rook and 2 pawns versus Rook and 2 pawns, as his king is far further advanced. So he's got much better chances here to win than Fischer does. We see Rook takes H2 and King C5. This should objectively be a draw, though. Like, the Rook should be able to cut off the king. So King C5. King, wait, Rook B1. Oh, okay, wait, sorry, I missed a couple moves. Rook B1, King to F7 is the move. Let me just promote this variation. A3, King to E6, B3, okay. And after all of this, Fischer takes the pawn on H2. That was my bad there. My bad. Magnus won in the last game of the Blitz tiebreak. Okay, cool. Alright, Rook takes H2. Now King C5. King comes back to D7. King B6. And Fischer decides, okay, you can have my pawns. I'm just going to go for your A pawn. So he goes Rook to A2. And now he's just going for a Rook versus Rook and pawn. So King takes A6. Rook takes A3. And he doesn't take this for whatever reason. So Fischer gives the annotation that King takes B5, King C7 leads to an easy book draw. I don't see how this is any better a chance to go for a win, but I guess he's trying to go King D6, King B6, take it at the opportune time. I guess it'll always be there for him. He can always take this pawn. So king b7. Now king d6. King b6. King d7. Now white goes b4, so he's advancing his pawn before taking this one. That makes good sense to me. Now he might be threatening king b7. And if the king goes back to d6, with the pawn on b4, he stops anything from coming to c5. So there is rook d1 check, forcing the king away, and then he comes back to win this pawn. So it's a little bit crazy. Yeah, it's a little bit complicated, but it is a good idea. b4. Now the rook comes to h3, getting ready to give lateral checks. Rook to c1 and rook h8. Okay, so Fischer's really just playing any old move. And he said he was scolded by his coach for playing this so fast because he's only taking a couple of seconds on each move and not playing the most precisely. This rook h8 looks very unclear. But okay, let's see how he holds this. Rook b8 check. This is an instructive ending. King a4, rook a8. King to b3, rook to c8. So this ending, if the rooks are traded, it will be drawn because the king can avoid any sort of opposition tricks if the rooks are traded off. So rook c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8. King comes here, and king b8 is a draw. I was saying that you can avoid opposition tricks because you just wait like this, and once the king comes to the 5th rank, you create the opposition. Same for this, you create the opposition, but you want to be careful not to play something like king b7 and allow white to gain the opposition, king b5, and then something like this. And now you're just losing. So king b8 is an important move that forces the draw. Therefore, they agree to a draw in this position. So that was 4 games for today. We looked at 4 Fischer games that were very instructive. Now we're going to move on to some other things, unless you guys have any specific questions about this ending. We are going to look at Daniel Siegel's game. He was the first to donate and redeem this Get Your Game Analyzed for $3 or 300 bits.